Hello, everybody. Hi, good morning or good afternoon, good evening everywhere. My name is Zhang Mei. I'm the founder of WildChina and also the moderator for today's book discussion. WildChina, some of you already probably know, are good friends. We create and curate in-depth explorations in China for individuals, companies, and schools. Since no one, well, right now a lot of us are in the United States. We can't travel. So we thought we could bring China to you. And so we have a whole series of WildChina on-air conversations, and also one book a month we read for a book club. Now, Ken's book, Mr. Ken Wilcox, Leading Through Culture, this one I have in my hand, comes in a slightly different angle. Because he's mostly talking about managing Silicon Valley Bank in the United States. But as I read the book, by the way, the ending section, if you haven't gotten there, talks about his journey in building a bank, a joint venture in Shanghai. But as I read the book, I cannot stop but thinking almost everything Ken's talking about in managing Silicon Valley Bank in the United States is something I've experienced or witnessed when managing a business in China. That is to say, I feel like in the private sector, if we're not directly controlled in state shareholders, the fundamental challenges of leading an organization are in fact very, very similar. Ken, interestingly enough, in fact, the last bit of your JV experience in China seemed quite different from my experience, mostly because I'm involved in private business. Anyway, so I'm delighted to have Ken here. Now, Ken knows almost everybody in the US-China circle in the Bay Area, and he really needs no introduction. But for those dialing in for the first time, I'll share a couple of highlights from Ken's bio. Ken currently serves as Emeritus Chairman of Silicon Valley Bank and was Vice Chairman of Shanghai Pudong Development Silicon Valley Bank. That's the joint venture. And Ken was previously the CEO of Silicon Valley Bank Financial Group. In that role, he successfully led the bank to expand and diversify and build an extraordinary pool of clients, including some very, very high-end wineries and technology companies in the Bay Area, right? And Ken is probably among the most active retired executive that I know, and serving on various nonprofit organizations, including being the chairman of Asia Society's Northern California chapter, also as treasurer of the Asian Art Museum, and supports quite a few other organizations as well. Now, Ken has an MBA from Harvard Business School. That's not surprising, but what's most surprising is he has a PhD in German studies from Ohio State. We'll definitely talk about that later. And so last bit on logistics. Today we have exactly 1 hour, and Ken will talk for about 20 minutes. And then I will kick off with a few questions. And anyone with questions, please feel free to either raise your hand or put your question in the chat room. We will have the last 20 minutes for Q&As from the audience. So with that, Ken, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you. Tell us about this book. I love reading it.
Thank you very much, May. I really appreciate this opportunity. That's so nice of you. And if anybody is wondering, because my head's kind of blocking it, my virtual background there is a Buddha, that Buddha statue, which is just a head, just a bust, is about, I think, about 3 stories tall. It's in Zhejiang province at a place called Shaoxing. And I think it's a Tang era statue. So I feel that, you know, it makes me feel like I'm being inspired by the Buddha right behind me. And hopefully that will help me do a better job here today too. So what I want to do in my first few minutes is give you a sense of why I wrote this book in the first place, under what circumstances. In a sense, I did it pretty quickly because I put a big rush on myself in the last 3 months of last year. Of 2019, and the book came out in January. On the other hand, I'd been dabbling, working on this book in spare hours for about 12 years. So it's kind of a collection of my experiences over an extended period of time. So what caused me to write this book in the first place? It's, in a sense, it's a simple story. I was with Silicon Valley Bank for 30 years. I actually ended my formal relationship with Silicon Valley Bank on December 31st, 2019, so just a few months ago. I was CEO of Silicon Valley Bank from 2001 until 2010. So that was a 10-year period. And at that point, I was scheduled to retire and basically go home and play with the grandchildren. But something unusual happened in 2010, and that is that we got word from Beijing that they would not just welcome us, but with open arms. They were anxious to have us come to China. And so we accepted the invitation, and then we looked around and tried to figure out who was going to go. And it turned out that I was fundamentally the only person that really wanted to go for whatever reason. So I raised my hand. They said, that'd be great. And especially because of my haircut, they felt that somebody who looks a little older is going to garner more respect in China. And I will say, I definitely have garnered more respect in China than I ever did here, for sure. So I went home and I told my wife about this opportunity, and she said, oh, we got to go. This is just too good to pass up. So we did. And we've been back for about 6 years. But the origin of the book looks like this. When I became CEO in 2001, it was possibly the worst time for me to become CEO of Silicon Valley Bank. A whole handful of reasons, and I'll just run through them quickly. First of all, my predecessor was an extremely charismatic kind of a person. And this is just a little bit of advice for anybody on the side, and that is if you're going to be CEO of an organization, try to avoid being CEO right after a CEO who's charismatic, because everybody loved this guy. Everybody loved him, and everybody was his best friend, so to speak. And I think I'm okay, but I don't think anybody ever thinks of me as charismatic. So that was problem number one. Problem number two, which was a much bigger deal, was that our strategy, the strategy that we'd been pursuing for the 10 years prior, or even 20 years prior, was exhausted. It's a little bit like somebody's got an orange and they're squeezing the juice out of it. And when they squeeze all the juice out of it, they normally just throw the peel overboard, right? Well, we'd squeezed all the juice out of that orange that we possibly could. So I started out on day one, which was basically, I think, April 1st, 2001, with an empty orange, and had to figure out what to do about it. That was problem number two. And problem number three was, and at the time I didn't realize it, but in retrospect, I found out that my first day as CEO was almost exactly, according to the Federal Reserve, the first day of the Great Recession, the so-called dot-com debacle. And it started with the dot-com companies in spring of 2001, and then it extended to the communications companies. By the way, our bank, Silicon Valley Bank, as Mei said, deals literally only with technology companies and with venture capitalists, except for a tiny little portion of the portfolio, under 1%, is premium wineries. And the premium wineries are only in the northwest of the US, California, Oregon, and Washington, whereas the technology and the venture capital is worldwide. We're a worldwide organization. So I started my tenure as CEO in the beginning of the recession. And then the fourth thing that was not too good was that, and this is actually tied into the recession, for the first several quarters of my tenure as CEO, every quarter was worse than the last one from Wall Street's point of view. And we had a board member who was a fairly amusing guy. I still talk to him regularly, who used to say, one of his favorite sayings is, if the CEO enjoyed the board meeting, it probably wasn't a good one. And so we didn't have any good board meetings for the first 3 years or so, because every quarter it would look worse than the one prior to it. And then this is where the Chinese enters into the equation. So if for all of you who speak Chinese, this was one of those Wei situations. It's a crisis, but it's got both elements. It's got the danger of the crisis and it's got the opportunity. At the time, I wasn't really thinking of it that way because I hadn't started studying Chinese yet. But in retrospect, it was definitely a typical Chinese crisis, opportunity and danger. And the danger was that I was going to get fired because Wall Street hated me. The board questioned me. The employees were largely disappointed because I wasn't as charismatic as the last guy. On the other hand, the way I looked at it was everything is so bad, I can't possibly make things worse. So I might as well take the opportunity to change anything I want to because nobody's going to like me anyway. So I should do what I think is right and we'll just see what happens. Let the cards fall as they will. So I took the opportunity to change the entire bank's business model. And again, in retrospect, people are thankful that we did that because the bank is amazingly successful. And it's largely because we changed the business model so substantially in 2001. Basically, what we did was three things. One was that we used to be, prior to 2001, only about 20% of our bank was focused on technology, and the rest was focused on the kinds of things other banks do. Every other bank, real estate, small business, big corporations, but not technology. And my reasoning was technology was the only thing that was special about us, that we did well. And the other thing is that none of the other banks were very good at it. So we spent the first 3 years of my being CEO getting rid of the 80% of the bank that wasn't technology and replacing it with technology. So we moved from 20% technology to 100% technology in about 3 years. And that's pretty amazing because it wasn't a tiny bank. It was a fairly large bank already. The second thing we did was, up until 2001, when we dealt with technology companies, we only dealt with tiny ones, with venture-backed technology companies. And when they got big enough that they didn't need the venture capitalists anymore, and they were able to spread their wings and maybe go public, we used to just let them go. They would drift off to one of our competitors, like Bank of America or Wells Fargo. And we decided this is stupid. We're doing all the hard work. And then those bigger banks are gaining all the benefit. So we invested several $100 million in those first 3 years on product that enabled us to keep those companies no matter how big they got. And so today, we're very proud that we start working with a company when it's only a person and an idea. And we've got gigantic companies as customers today because they've stayed with us the whole time. And then the third thing we decided to do was go global. And prior to 2001, we were only in the US. We decided to go global because technology is a global phenomenon. There's no such thing as a great technology that doesn't go global. Because first of all, if your technology is fantastic, everybody in the world wants it. And the second thing is, even if you try to stop it, technology moves through borders, either legally or illegally, either with pay or without pay. It moves across borders. You can't stop it. Not even Trump's wall could stop technology from moving around the world. So we just decided that we would not worry about whether people thought we were doing a good job or not. We'd do what was right. That said, I still, at that point in time, had never been CEO before. Of course, I'd had some management positions, but I'd never been CEO, and I didn't really know how to be. I didn't know what I should do except follow my nose and my instincts. So I looked around for good examples, and quite frankly, this may sound a little bit arrogant, but I didn't see that many good examples out there. Probably because the press emphasizes the bad examples. And in my own life, I didn't think that the CEOs of the places where I had worked were that fantastic. I got a coach and I started reading books. And then I started on weekends writing down what I learned. And, you know, writing down what you learn and reflecting on your experience and what you learned, both in terms of successes and in terms of errors, that's really a good way to take advantage of your experience and remember what works and what doesn't work. And those notes piled up over 12 years, and finally I wrote them down at the end of last year. The only other thing I'd say by introduction, and we'll turn it over to Mei, and that is the subtitle of my book is, or actually the book title is, Leading Through Culture. The subtitle is How Real Leaders Create Cultures That Motivate People to Achieve Great Things. And I just want to say one thing about the origin of that title. So one day in 2008, I got a call from somebody at Stanford who wanted me to come over and teach 1 hour in a class for entrepreneurs. And I said, what about? And they said, whatever you want to talk about, just talk about your life. It doesn't make any difference. So I got there and I was quite surprised because as soon as I got in the door, the person who had invited me rushed up and gave me a piece of paper to sign. It was one of those pieces of paper that turns the rights to whatever you say over to Stanford so that they can do whatever they want with it. And without even realizing that I'd said anything momentous, I somewhere in my speech, I said, culture trumps strategy. That has nothing to do with the current president, by the way. And to be totally candid, even though I'd like to take credit for that idea, it's not an original idea with me. It was original in the sense that I didn't realize anybody else had said it before, but it turns out Peter Drucker had said it about 15 years before. So at least I'm, in good company. And then I went home and I forgot about it. And a couple of months later, I had an appointment with somebody that I'd never seen before. And as soon as they came into my office, they said, that speech that's on the web, that is so good. And I love what you said about culture trumping strategy. And I didn't even realize. So I went back and looked myself, and sure enough, I'd said that. And ever since then, I think that was my my sort of 10 minutes of 5 minutes of fame, because I can't tell you the number of people that have said to me, yeah, that speech was really good. I think it's the only time I've ever said anything that anybody has quoted, but it was very, very quotable. And the reason I said it, and then I'll turn it over to Mei, is that I firmly believe that people put too little emphasis on culture and too much on strategy. And here's why. If you have a great strategy, but a crappy culture, I will guarantee you, your company will stumble. It might even fail. But if you have a great culture and just a so-so strategy or even a poor one, I will almost guarantee you that the people in your company will come together and they will create a winning strategy, because strategy is a product of the mind. You can just go hire somebody from Harvard Business School to come in and help you with your strategy, but you can't hire anybody from anywhere to come in and help you with your culture. I mean, you can try, but the culture is a product of the leader and the team around the leader. And the culture speaks to the heart, not to the mind. The strategy speaks to the employee's mind, but the culture speaks to their hearts. And people are, I think, primarily motivated by what their heart says more than what their mind says. It's emotions that drive the world, I believe. So I genuinely, single thing I've experienced in my entire business lifetime tells me that that's absolutely the case. Culture is the most important. So with that, Mei, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ken. I have to say, this book is such a provocative reading, actually. It's very wise, but it provokes you to think. So I would highly advise all the readers, do not read it before going to bed, because you risk not being able to fall asleep. You will think so much. So what makes a great culture? So Ken, you were talking about this culture. What makes a culture great?
Well, one of the things I obviously do in this book is to outline aspects of better cultures. Of course, every single organization has a culture, whether they know they do or whether they don't. Because whenever people come together in a group, norms emerge, norms evolve. And the norms are all around how people treat each other, not just each other, but how they treat the rest of the world. So every company and you stop and think about it, think about companies that you have a good association with and companies that you don't. I will almost guarantee you that it's a product of their culture. The way they treat you is an aspect of their culture. And the way they treat each other also is an aspect of their culture. So I'm going to list here 4 or 5 things that I think are typical of really good cultures. Places that are happy places to work. And when people are happy, they're much more productive. So here are 4 or 5 examples. One of them is, does this organization, it doesn't make any difference, by the way, whether you're talking about a company or a school or anything, it's just an organization. Does this organization motivate people with encouragement or with fear? So you may wonder, why would I say that? Who would try to motivate by fear? Well, I'll give you a good example. Richard Nixon actually is quoted as saying, and I've got a Saturday Evening Post article in my file from the Nixon years. And he actually says to the journalist something like, this whole idea that love, he uses the word love, I say encouragement, that love motivates people is totally wrong. We learn that in church, but it's ridiculous. Fear is the only motivator. That's Richard Nixon. So, and I think if you've had experience in companies or other organizations, which I know all of you had, think about it in that those terms. Do the leaders motivate through encouragement, or do they motivate through fear? I obviously say encouragement works much better. A second one is one that I'll state in banking terms because I'm most familiar with them, but it applies to any company or any organization. I used to think that in terms of this dichotomy, what I call cops and robbers versus an internal voice. And most banks, in my experience, have this cops and robbers mentality, that you've got the adults and the children, and the adults are the cops and the rest of the employees are the robbers. And the cops are constantly trying to make sure that the robbers aren't doing something that they shouldn't do. A much, much better method is what I call the internal voice. And that's where the leadership, in a very patient and kind and understanding way, explains to the employees its expectations, and does so repeatedly and in such a convincing manner that the employees internalize this voice. And soon they don't need management anymore, because when they're at a crossroads, they know what to do. The internal voice in them tells them what to do. And it particularly involves the way they treat other people, as well as ethics. And that's, in banks, that's quite a problem, because how many banks have you read about in the past few years that have had serious ethical problems. And somebody always ends up saying, well, it's because they have a questionable culture, and culture emanates from the top. So we've got to change the people at the top. They've got to create a new culture and start all over again. And I really think that at Silicon Valley Bank, management seldom has to tell people, remind them of our values, because they've internalized them, and the voice in them tells them what to do. We can count on our employees, all the SVBers, when there's an ethical question, they know what to do. They do the right thing. A third thing would be, is your organization, or your, let's say your corporation, is it more vertical or horizontal? Horizontal corporations are one that put a lot of emphasis on collaboration between people from different departments, learning how to get along well with the people in the other departments so you can come together to solve problems. Vertical corporations are the ones where most employees spend their time kissing up and pushing down. In other words, they torment the people that report to them, and they're constantly flattering the people they report to. Those corporations are so unhappy because there's so much politics in them. And I think in many corporations that work that way, which I think is most actually, they spend, average employee probably spends 50% of their time thinking about how to kiss up and how to push down, and the other 50% of the time doing their work, because their goal is getting ahead of everybody else. It's not helping their coworkers solve problems for their clients. So that would be three. I'll just give two more and I'll move on. The fourth one would be, are you a dog sled or an orchestra? And the dog sled thing amazes me. I didn't know anything about dog sleds till about, I don't know, 10 years ago. I met a guy who was in the Danish military, and his whole job, he was only about 26, his whole job in the Danish military, he was part of special forces. And you may know that little tiny Denmark actually owns Greenland, which isn't green. And you may also know that Russia covets Greenland because it's got a lot of natural resources. So Denmark has to constantly restake its claim to Greenland. And it does so by these special forces. Their special forces have, I don't know, 50 or so different dog sleds. And these dog sled drivers spend all year traversing the entirety of Greenland, restaking their claim, and looking out for any Russians that they can report back to the Danish military. And so he was telling me about this experience, and it's cold out there. It's freezing all the time. And there are only two people in a team. So he told me, though, this interesting thing. He said at night, he says, you know, when you see a dog sled, it looks so graceful. And you see all these dogs out in front, and they look like they're the happiest team on earth. You know, they're pulling this dog sled. But at night, he says, you have to tether each dog about 20 feet from all the other dogs, because those dogs, every one of them wants to kill the dog in front of him. Every one of them wants to move up the chain and be the lead dog. And they will literally gnaw at their tether until they can break loose and try to kill the dog who's ahead of them. And how many times have you worked in a corporation where people are like that? They're constantly trying to kill the people ahead of them so that they can work their way to the top. A much better metaphor for a corporation or any organization is an orchestra. An orchestra is a place where a diverse group of 80 or 100 or 130 people come together, and they don't fight, they don't argue, they all play their part from the same sheet of music, and they all play in unison. And because they do that, they create beautiful music. And every one of them is important. It's not true they all get paid the same, because I do know that lead violins get paid much more than third trombones. When I was in an orchestra, I was always a third trombone. But what they get paid isn't what counts. It's whether or not they are willing to subjugate their own egos to the needs of the orchestra. And that's how they play beautiful music. And my last point on a good culture would be, there's this thing that I believe in that I call the spectrum of human behavior. And the spectrum, everybody in the world fits on it somewhere. In the middle of the spectrum are the adult to adult people. These are people that know how to work with others in order to solve problems. They may have totally different views, but they're mature people. So they know how to get together with other mature people and discuss a problem and resolve it. You want in your organization or your corporation, you want to have everybody in the middle of the spectrum, because that's how things get done. Unfortunately, corporations are loaded with people at the opposite ends of the spectrum. One end of the spectrum is the obnoxiously assertive people. These are the people that always want their way, and they're usually very loud and noisy about getting it. At the other end of the spectrum are the passive aggressive people. These are people that are quiet, and they never really express their opinions. They always agree in public with whoever is in charge or whoever is pushiest. And then, of course, when the meeting is over and they go out into the hallway, they get together in small groups and say nasty things about the people that were driving the meeting. And those two groups of people, the passive aggressive and the obnoxiously assertive, you don't want them in your corporation or in your organization, because they make problem solving, and that's what organizations do. They solve problems. They make problem solving almost impossible. And here's the tricky part. When I became CEO of Silicon Valley Bank in 2001, I realized that we had a lot of both. And I thought, how are we going to get rid of them? Well, first of all, we have to identify who they are. The obnoxiously assertive people are easy to identify because they're so noisy and they're always in a fight with somebody. So you can find them and either coach them to the middle or ask them to go work someplace else. The passive aggressive people are hard to find because they're always agreeing with you. And if you're normal, when people agree with you, you usually think, oh, they're very nice people and they're smart too because they agree with me. But a lot of times when people are agreeing with you, they're only pretending. And when your back is turned, they'll tell everybody else how dumb you are. So it took less than a year to find all the obnoxiously assertive people and either coach them to the middle or ask them to go. It took years to find all of the passive aggressive people. And I still don't know that we've got them all. I don't really know. So those are some of the aspects of a good culture, in my opinion.
This sets up a lot of homework for everybody in the management position to think about, right?
Yeah.
One of the motivate how the leadership motivates the employee, how people treat each other, whether the culture is vertical or horizontal, dog-sled or orchestra, or move everybody to adult. These are the 5 points. And among them, let me single out one and dig a little deeper. Vertical versus horizontal. You know, a lot of cultures now, the world is so global. You will end up having, in your experience, you'll have a Chinese team, which is traditionally much more hierarchical, vertical, merging with a Western team or international team, which tends to be more horizontal. How do you resolve conflict? What are the sort of are there simple tricks we can start practicing today?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting that you picked the most difficult one of the 5 that I mentioned. I would say that one, horizontal versus vertical, there are a lot of people who just don't understand that. And you have to spend a lot of time helping them to understand it because they may have grown up in an authoritarian family, or they may have grown up in a more authoritarian culture. So it's hard for them to understand that. I remember when we first started building our bank in China. It's a joint venture bank. It's a combination of Silicon Valley Bank and the Shanghai government, or specifically Shanghai Pudong Development Bank. When we first started building it, we spent huge amounts of time working on the culture. And these are, long discussions, long conversations. And you ask yourself, isn't that boring? How can you spend all that time? Why shouldn't you be doing business? Well, the Chinese government made it easier for us to focus on culture because they forbade us, even though they own 50% of the joint venture, they forbade us from using Chinese currency for the first 3 years. And they said, you can't use Chinese currency for the first 3 years, but don't worry, there's lots for you to do, because you can spend all those 3 years teaching Chinese banks your business model, which of course is, from a Western point of view, it's not a good idea to teach potential competitors your business model. But because we couldn't do anything else, I spent most of my time working on the culture, and we would discuss these things at length. And I remember one time we had a consultant come in, and we said, during a coffee break, I was talking to this consultant. This is in China. And I said, what is your biggest challenge working with companies in China? And he said, the most difficult challenge was when he was engaged by a family-owned business, because very often, and that may be changing because everything changes in this world, but he said very often the family-owned business would have a patriarch. A founder of the business, maybe a generation ago, at this point an older person, almost always a male in that era, would be running the business, and he would make all the decisions, because that's what he thinks his role is making all the decisions. He's the decidinator. And then he would complain to the consultant. He'd call the consultant in and he'd say, I just don't understand it. Why is it that none of these people that work for me are the least bit innovative? They don't come up with any ideas on their own. I have to tell them everything. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a vicious cycle, really, that takes place. But I do want to also point out that although culture has a major influence on people, innate personality characteristics do too. So there are certainly plenty of people in more authoritarian cultures who are innovative than you might guess. And there are certainly more people in our supposedly liberal culture in the US who are authoritarian. So it's not like all of China, by way of example, has people that are vertical, and all of the US has people who are horizontal. It doesn't work that way at all in real life. So it's tempting to make generalizations. But I think there's, Mei, I don't think there's any solution other than group discussions over an extended period of time, going over and over the same territory and having people talk and explain what they think, because you can't change somebody's mind by telling them they've got to change their mind. That's impossible.
I wish today's discussion, well, if we don't have questions from the audience, I'm just going to keep asking questions, because I am fascinated by this vertical versus horizontal. Now we have people talking, but because people are from diversely different cultures, let's say you put an Indian, an American, a Chinese, and a Latin American in one room, the vocal will dominate the conversation. And then we're saying, okay, now we're driving the company to flat, horizontal structure. And then all the quiet, probably the ones are like, no, passive aggressively, I may agree, but it's not really the case.
Yeah. So it's really, is that your dog or mine?
Mine, you keep talking. I'll get someone to talk.
So it's very difficult when you're working in a group setting to know who's thinking what. It's tempting to assume that you can tell what people are thinking by virtue of what they say, but it's not always the case, because the people who are talking are the ones that are more comfortable talking, and the people who aren't talking are often the ones who are less comfortable talking, and the people that are less comfortable talking may actually be smarter than the people who are comfortable talking. Especially in the US, but I think probably worldwide, we have a tendency to equate intelligence with forcefulness. You know, somebody's forceful and we think, oh, they're really smart people. But it could be the person sitting next to them who's not that forceful is actually much smarter. And so it's really important to try hard to bring out the quiet ones, because the quiet ones are often the ones, not always, but often have the best thoughts. So it is really important to pull them out. And I also think that although culture has a profound impact on people, it can't completely override their personality. So for example, in my experience in Shanghai, especially in the first year or two, there were so many people, almost everybody who works there in our bank, by the way. Today, everybody who works in our bank in Shanghai is Chinese, PRC Chinese. Then we had like 95% PRC Chinese and about 5% Westerners in the first year or two. And it was so often the case that the PRC Chinese would, when we were in a discussion, my management team, we're in a discussion, they would start out by saying something like, they're giving us a short report on some project, and they'd say, they begin their description by saying, under the guidance of our leader, Ken, and with the help and hard work of all of the people on the team, we were able to bring the project this much forward. But the interesting thing is, the same people that would say that in a group, when I get them alone in my office, because my management style involves talking to people all the time. So I would be always in conversation with somebody. And that's how I develop my own thoughts, by the way, is by talking to people, because these are all smart people. They've all got good things going on upstairs. So when they would get alone with me, these same people that would start every paragraph with, under the guidance of our leader, Ken, and with the support and help of our team, they would tell me in the office when they were just by themselves with me that they did most of the work. And that they were really deserving of a promotion. So culture just pushes things down. It doesn't eliminate them, for sure. And but the other aspect of I'm just wandering here, I guess, but another aspect of this vertical versus horizontal that I think is really important to mention is that modern corporations are solving complex problems. You know, we may think that banks, the business is simple, just take in deposits, make loans, but it's actually, modern banking is very complex. And it takes a lot of smart people working together to actually solve problems. So here's the danger. In these vertical organizations, not only do people spend their time kissing up and pushing down, but they also come to believe that they're vertical, which may be finance, it may be HR, it may be sales, it may be operations, it may be IT, whatever it is. People believe that their vertical is the most important one in the organization. And they push hard to make sure that their vertical dominates. I once had I think one of my first bosses in banking 40 years ago used to say, when you're in a meeting with people from other departments, never give way to them. Always make sure that our department dominates, because he used to say, because corporations are scarce, have scarce resources, every one of them. And your job is to make sure we don't lose any of those resources to anybody else. The whole problem with that is that the person at the top of your vertical represents that vertical. And what in an ideal world, what they should be doing is trying to make sure that other departments are aware of their point of view, but not dominate. Because any organization that is dominated by any one of those disciplines is going to screw up. It's absolutely going to screw up. Think about it. What do the HR people want? They would, if HR people had their way, most of them would make sure that every employee in the organization was undergoing compliance training 24 hours a day, so that they could report back that they'd succeeded in getting everybody trained, or something silly like that. What if the finance people ran the organization? Finance people are control oriented on average, and they're also about not spending money. So they would stop everybody from spending money, and they would put the emphasis on control. And the organization might be perfect, but it's probably going to go out of business in a few years too. So it goes on like that.
Right, but here's Charles has a very good question to follow up on that. Can they coexist? Is it possible to manage both vertical and horizontal in one organization? Like, one China, two systems?
In fact, I would say to Charles,
yeah,
I would say you have to. You cannot be exclusively one way or the other. Because if you're totally vertical, your organization is highly likely to freeze in place, and there'll be very little innovation in the organization, in my opinion. On the other hand, if you're totally horizontal, especially if you don't have a strong management team and a strong CEO who can help build a culture and disseminate the culture, instill the values, then you're likely to end up with something that's a little bit chaotic, with everybody going in their own direction. So you need both the vertical and the horizontal. The reason that I put more emphasis on the horizontal is because historically, organizations have trended subconsciously toward the vertical. So my emphasis on the horizontal is a counterbalance to the natural tendency of an organization to be vertical. But I do think you need both, and it is possible to do both.
Okay. Now, Tom has a question there. Based on your experience with Pudong's local government, what are the main difference or cultural changes of their leaders over the past 2 decades, I would say?
Well, now we're getting into dangerous territory here, but
we can be brief. And then I want to ask I want to ask you to tell the stories of the Four Seasons concierge.
Yeah. I do think that there's absolutely no doubt China is evolving. Every country is evolving, and I would say this. If you were to ask me how I would describe my experiences in China in 2 sentences, which of course is gross oversimplification, but I would say this. I would say that in general, the Chinese people I worked with, and almost everybody I worked with was Chinese. We had very little contact with Westerners when we were in China. Are delightful people, smart people, hardworking people, and fun people. No question about it. But, and there's the but, I believe that the Chinese Communist Party, that system has some real severe disadvantages. And it forces people into a mold or into a direction that, at least from the point of view of the foreigner trying to build a company, can be detrimental. Very big obstacles. I mean, the whole idea that that the Chinese government entered into a joint venture with us to build a bank. And then as soon as we open our doors, we're not allowed to use Chinese currency for 3 years. The reason they wanted that to be that way is so obvious that I don't even have to describe it. So the difference in the past 20 years, because I have been doing business in China for 20 years now, is that it's more nuanced today. And the people that I'm working with are, first of all, much more sophisticated than 20 years ago, much more knowledgeable about other parts of the world, other ways of doing things, other people's approaches. And frankly, I think as individuals, easier to work with. But I would say, on the other hand, I don't actually think that the approach taken by the CCP has changed a huge amount. So I think that people are still, they still are forced by virtue of the way the system works to behave in ways that I find problematic. So there's obviously there's change, and the change is for the most part for the better. But I certainly don't think that that it's the best place in the world for a Western company because of the challenges that the Western companies have to face.
Okay.
That's my answer.
Thank you. Before we get back to Charles' question, tell us about your hiring of the Four Seasons concierge person and turn this into the biggest revenue generator. 3 questions here. What did you see in this person? How did you convince to bring such an unusual resume into your organization and fit into your HR department? You know, how do you convince the organization to accept? And 3, how did you smoothly transition this person and position him for success?
The second one was easy because I was in charge. So
they would tell you like the pay grade isn't quite right.
No, I know, and that's a problem. And HR people often have problems with that pay grade issue. But I will say this: banking is like most other businesses in the sense that it's about making people happy. If you are incapable of making your clients happy, you will not have a business as soon as somebody else comes along who's able to offer the same product and make the customer happy. So it's of the utmost importance that bankers learn to make their customers happy. And to do that, you need the kinds of people as employees who get a kick out of making other people happy. Not in a manipulative way, not like, oh, I made Mei happy and now I'm, really an important guy, but more because I genuinely would like to see Mei be happy. And so I thought about that and thought about this. This is in the middle of my career a long time ago. And so one day I said to myself, how do you get employees to focus on making customers happy? And I thought, I wonder, I should call somebody in an organization who is known for making customers happy. And I was working in Boston at the time, and I thought about the Four Seasons in Boston. Everybody I'd ever heard of at that point in time who stayed at the Four Seasons in Boston said they had a good experience. They liked the place. So 2 things came out of that. One was I called the manager of the Four Seasons in Boston at the time. His name was Robin Brown. This was about 40 years ago. I still remember the guy. And I said, I so admire your customer service. Everybody says nice things. So can you tell me how you do that? And he said, oh, I'd love to. Come on down. We had a 3-hour lunch together in the restaurant of the Four Seasons. And he told me, he said, the key is not that difficult. Hire people who are the kinds of people who want to make other people happy, because that's what this business is all about. And he says, I can train people in the technical side of being a hotel without that much difficulty. But I could get a genius in here, and if they're not the kind of person who wants to make other people happy, I can't possibly change their character. No amount of training. So he says our hiring is all directed at figuring out which of the people that are applying for jobs are the kinds of people who want to make other people happy. And he said in the simplest terms, are they the kind of people that will, this is Boston, remember, not California, are they the kind of people who will shovel the neighbor's walk because the neighbor's too ill to come out and shovel their walk? Are they the kind of people who take their grandmother some gift or something when the grandmother's not feeling well? What kind of people are they? And he says, I hire those people. Anybody could train them how to the technical side of running a hotel. And so I thought, this is really important. And then I guess, in a way, it wasn't a very nice way to return the favor. I was so impressed with his concierge. This was not the same day, by the way. I waited a few months. But I was so impressed with his concierge that I asked him if he would, the concierge, who was at the time, he's about 25, 26 years old. I asked him if he had any interest in trying something else. And he said, well, possibly. So I invited him to get together for a conversation with me. And over the course of a couple of months, I encouraged him to try working at our bank. And the truth is, he was just so good at making his clients happy, and really happy. Not, as I say, and if you're being manipulated into being happy, you'll soon see through it and you won't be happy anymore. But he really went out of his way to try to make sure that their needs were met. And interestingly, he was in the part of the business that involves the riskiest clients, and therefore the clients that have to pay the most. But he still made them happy. And there were several years running where he was the biggest revenue generator in our bank. And then what happened was, I will have to admit this, it makes me a little sad to admit it, but about a year and a half ago, he was doing such a fabulous job that the people at JP Morgan were very upset because he was always winning any competition and they couldn't take his clients away from him. So they talked about it and they passed the message up to the top, and Jamie Dimon himself, you know, the king of banking here in the US, actually called this guy and pleaded with him to come to JP Morgan. And, you know, the truth is, when somebody in middle management gets a call from the top person at a giant, highly reputable bank like JP Morgan, and that CEO begs them to come, it's hard to resist. And I also know that the pay package was pretty good, out of market, let's say. So we lost him to JP Morgan. It's sad, but that's life.
But what a stellar career you've created for this young man.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
an incredible story. I see some really, really good questions here, but we are out of time. I am so sad. I think, Ken, I'd have to get you for a private noodle soup lunch. I will cook and I will ask all the questions, and I'll write a blog to share all my learnings with everybody. In parting, I just want to say thank you, Ken. This is just an amazing. I want to ask one last question, which Kathy Chen submitted earlier, is what can we do in our daily lives to develop our own leadership and maybe contribute to building a great culture? Maybe a couple of tips for us to take away and start this day.
Yeah. Well, I'll answer a different question because that's too hard, but I will, one that's very much parallel, and that is, what makes a good leader? My opinion is that there are basically, in a very fundamental way, two kinds of leaders. Unfortunately, we have way too many of the wrong kind and not enough of the right kind. just think about politics for a minute, because that's another form of leadership or arena for the display of leadership. And you'll have it'll become clear to you quickly what I'm saying. Really good leaders are people who have two characteristics. One is they care more about other people than they necessarily do. Of course, everybody cares about themselves, but their goal is to do something good for other people. And they have a vision of what that is. And it's a vision that is compelling to others, because if that vision is realized, the lives of the people will become better. And the second thing, which is very closely related, is real leaders are not after power or money. Real leaders are after accomplishing something that is useful to the world. And so I would say that anybody can learn to lead, but learning to lead is not primarily technique, although there is technique in it. A lot of learning to lead is becoming the kind of person who makes a good leader. And I firmly believe that at least 95% of the population can develop themselves in that direction. So that's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you everybody for getting up early or staying late to watch this conversation. We learned a tremendous amount, Ken. I think I am positive it's on its way to New York Times bestseller list.
I doubt that, but thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
Anyone really else want to stay tuned for more events, sign up for our newsletter or follow our WeChat account, English WeChat account, WildChina Journeys, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Say hi to Ruth.
Yes, I will. Say hi to John. Best wishes to everybody. Bye-bye.
Yes, take care. Best wishes, everybody.